Amid surging migration and economic challenges, Mexico's president comes to Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador met with U.S. President Joe Biden in Washington on Tuesday. Both countries face a surge in migration and growing differences on trade, energy, and the Ukraine conflict. For more, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. So Nathan, this was the second time the Mexican president has met with President Biden. What did the two sides hope to accomplish?
In fact, they should have met another time too, last month at the Summit of the Americas, of course, on the West Coast. But as you know, President López Obrador boycotted that after saying that it should be an inclusive hemispheric meeting with the likes of Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua going. So he sent his foreign minister instead. Other delegations downgraded from heads of state or heads of government, which was a big embarrassment for the Biden administration, who really wanted to sort of re-engage with the region. So very much sort of papering over the cracks, if you like, this meeting at the White House. They do have a lot to talk about, but much of it was telling the rest of the world that they do get on, although there's some sort of gentle ribbing at each other. Let's take a listen.
Mr. President, this is a relationship that directly impacts the daily lives of our people. And despite the overhyped headlines that we sometimes see, you and I have a strong and productive relationship.
In spite of our differences and our grievances that are not easy to forget, neither with time nor with good intentions, on many occasions we've been able to meet and work together as good friends and true allies.
Now, the big thing, obviously, is migration on the U.S. southern border, northern border for Mexico. As you know, there has been a migration crisis building for many months, hundreds of thousands of engagements by border forces in the U.S. with migrants there at record levels. López Obrador said, look, there is an employment crisis. You can't get enough workers in the U.S. Migrants have been very good about filling in that gap. Let's have hundreds of thousands more visas for both Mexicans and Central Americans, and you can help with that. But he also said, look, we understand you have the conservatives in your domestic political sphere, which will make that very happen. He encouraged Biden to be brave on that front. And Biden sort of hit back and said, look, we have given more visas, especially for work, H-2 visas, etc. We've given money for infrastructure. But they do differ in a lot of other respects as well when it comes to the economic relationship. Remember, we had the NAFTA free trade agreement replaced on the Trump administration with USMCA, which has actually led to a big spike in disputes over labor with Mexico from the US. The US doesn't like the nationalization sort of tip towards the oil industry in Mexico. Mexico is saying, hey, look, our gas is $1 cheaper. Some people are driving over the border to get it. So that was a little dig at Biden too.
So Nathan, as you say, there are differences, and I think it's fair to say that López Obrador has had something of a challenging relationship with President Biden. What are some of the other major policy differences?
You know, yeah, because when you talk about the US, one of its amazing geopolitical things is it has two extremely friendly neighbors, Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, and they are so intertwined. But this relationship has not been good, and I touched on, obviously, the migration, trade issue. But when it comes to fundamental issues, Ukraine, for example, and Mexico has been independent and basically saying they are going to be neutral. They have said getting into Ukraine is a mistake, and López Obrador says that at every opportunity. He's even sort of criticized the extradition of Julian Assange, the whistleblower, who is now on his way soon, it looks like, to the US after a British court ruled. All these things have really sort of niggled at a relationship. And remember, both these men are sort of left of center. I mean, obviously López Obrador more so. There should be much more of a natural alliance, but AMLO seemed to get on better with the Trump administration in lots of ways because I think they sort of spoke honestly and were able to rib each other while also understanding how dependent they are on each other. But this is no chemistry that we've seen as we saw from the Summit of Americas last month.
Okay, Nathan, thanks. That's CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King reporting. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. After a dozen years at the helm, Michael Shifter recently stepped down as president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Benjamin Norton is the founder and editor of the independent news site multipolarista.com. Art Estepenen heads his own consulting firm after years of serving as a top advisor to the chair of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee. And Laura Carlson is the director of the Americas program in Mexico City. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Laura, if we look at this relationship between the United States and Mexico, Mexico is the second largest U.S. trading partner. There are very close links, economic and trade links. There's also very close and deep cultural links. But, you know, as Nathan King told us a moment ago, there are also tensions in this relationship, and these tensions center on things like trade, on things like drug trafficking, on things like migration. So what do you think the Mexican president was hoping to get out of this visit?
The Mexican president wanted to do two things that could be seen as slightly contradictory, but I don't think that are. First of all, he wanted to go and to meet with Joe Biden and to say, yes, we had a difference of opinion over the Summit of the Americas, where the Mexican president insisted that it include the other countries of the hemisphere, and where Joe Biden had announced from really quite early on that it would not, that they would not be invited, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So they wanted to sort of patch things over, I think both of them, in that regard. But on the other hand, it's always been very important for Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as a leftist president with a very strong position within the country, to mark his distance from the U.S. government. Now this, I also agree with the analysts that it's somewhat unfathomable why there was a closer relationship with Donald Trump than there has been with Joe Biden, given the ideological distance with Trump and outright threats in order to force Mexico to submit to a very strong anti-immigrant policy. But that is the way it's been. It's been a difficult relationship, and he has been marking his pathway, and immigration has been the most difficult. The other thing that I think it's really important to say is there tends to be confusion within the U.S. press and among certain analysts about what a good relationship between Mexico and the United States means. Mexico and the United States, to have a good relationship, cannot go back to Mexico being submissive. It will not end up in a positive outcome for Mexico. And if Mexico is weaker, if Mexico is more conflicted, poor, and has lower results in terms of both economy and security, it's not a good result for the United States either. So this distance could be seen as healthy in many ways, as long as they can get over some of those humps. And of course, again, immigration being one of the major ones at this point.
Art Estepenen, Mexico is technically in a recession right now. Inflation is running at about 8%. There are millions of people unemployed, 2 million people unemployed. There are many Mexicans who want to emigrate to the United States because of the poor economy in Mexico. Here is President López Obrador talking about his plans for legal migration to the United States. Let's listen.
We are going to deal with the migration issue. You know what our proposal is. What we want is for migration not to be forced. We want migration to be optional, legal, completely legal. And we want an agreement to be reached in that sense, to apply order to the migratory flow, to legalize it.
So, Art, listening there to that proposal, do you think it has any chance of success?
Well, coming from a Republican like myself, agreeing with President López Obrador may seem a little bit shocking to some people. But I agree. As an expert in Latin American politics for many years, I believe that, as my colleague said, Latin America and Mexico in particular is not the same Mexico as they were in the 80s or the 90s. And the United States, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, continues to hold the same type of view from Latin American major countries. And we live in 2022. And the reality is, like President López Obrador says, the U.S. needs these workers. I would personally advocate for a North and South American economic union that we could freely exchange all of these young people that are looking for work. And in the United States, we need these workers. So it is time for the United States leader and the U.S. Congress to realize that Latin America possesses an amazing opportunity for economic growth for the United States and for Latin America, but we need that type of leadership to join the countries and to join the
Right.
people to have priorities in education, in innovation, and other healthcare and other major issues.
Yeah.
Immigration is only one, but there are many other issues that can unite both continents.
Art, just one other point, and I'm asking you this because you just reminded us a moment ago that you are Republican, but how does one explain the fact that President Lopez Obrador had a better relationship with President Trump? And, as we heard earlier on, they are ideologically not partners. They have very different views. A better relationship with Trump than he has with President Biden.
Well, I think that President Trump was not a traditional politician who explains the fact that he met with Kim Jong-un from North Korea several times, and they had a very cordial relationship. The fact of the matter is that President Trump outlined what the United States stood for and the U.S. vision towards Mexico, and he either said, you take it or you leave it. And there were economic consequences for Mexico if they left it. So I believe that there's no magical answer. I believe that President Trump had a clear agenda towards Mexico, and he communicated that to President López Obrador.
Right. Michael Shifter, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, migratory flows from Mexico, from Central America as well, are expected to escalate in the months ahead because of increasing violence in the region. I mean, recently we saw that very tragic case where more than 50 people were found dead in the back of a truck. More than half of them were Mexicans. They were found near the United States city of San Antonio. So President Lopez Obrador wants the United States to issue more visas. And we know from early reports coming out of this meeting that there was agreement that Mexico will spend up to $1.5 billion on smart border technology, and that there was also agreement that the United States would issue thousands more visas. But how is that going to be seen in the United States, where we know that immigration is a very politically divisive issue?
Well, I think this is an area where the Biden administration, I think, could reach some common ground with the López Obrador government. I think they're moving ahead on trying to get some of these visas to legalize and manage more effectively these migratory flows. I'm not sure whether it's going to make a huge political impact, and especially, let's be very honest about it, we have elections coming up in a few months that are very high-stakes, crucial elections, and it's very hard to imagine that anything can be done. These measures, however, however useful, are really going to make much of a dent in terms of managing these flows. But I do think it's a solution that the Biden administration is looking at very seriously, and I think it's moving in that direction. The root causes strategy, which is sort of the centerpiece of the Biden administration, is at best, under the most optimistic conditions, a very long-term proposition, and you're not going to see much effect. So there is political pressure to try to at least manage, if not reduce, some of these flows. And I think some of these visa programs are a way forward. Let me just add, if I could, just to chime in on the other issue. I think it's very easy to understand why there's a better relationship between AMLO and Trump than AMLO and Biden. Trump didn't care about human rights issues or democracy issues or corruption issues in Mexico. And the Biden administration has a much broader agenda. And so it's raised these concerns. And AMLO doesn't like that. He sees that as interference. He's annoyed by it. He's irritated by it. With Trump, it was very simple. You do what I want, meaning AMLO does what Trump wants on migration, and we just ignore the rest. And AMLO liked that understanding. That's very different with Biden. And so I think it's very easy to understand why the relationship is more complicated and a bit more strained under Biden and AMLO.
I should remind our viewers that AMLO, the acronym that Michael Shifter is using there, is the shortened form of the Mexican president's full name, which was Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Benjamin Norton, let's come to you. Great to have you with us on the show. You know, Michael said something a moment ago explaining why the Mexican president has had a better relationship with President Trump than with President Biden, and he says that that's because President Biden is concerned about things like corruption and human rights in Mexico and other Latin American countries, and President Trump was not. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's certainly selective concern, and this is something that we see across administrations. The U.S. government raises concerns about human rights issues and corruption in countries where the U.S. doesn't have good relations, but it is conspicuously silent about corruption carried out by Washington's key allies, and I think Colombia is a classic example of this. The United Nations itself has reported many times that 70% of the world's cocaine comes from Colombia. We know that the current president of Colombia, Iván Duque, is closely linked to the drug trade, and as well as his political mentor, Álvaro Uribe. In fact, the prosecutor's office in Colombia was investigating a drug dealer named Niña Hernandez, who allegedly bought votes for Iván Duque in the 2018 election.
Right.
So this is pretty well documented, and unfortunately, we haven't seen much criticism of the systemic corruption in the Colombian government, not to mention the fact that every single year there are dozens of massacres in Colombia of human rights activists. But all you have to do is go next door to Colombia, to Venezuela, and of course we see selective outrage. So I think the fact that, you know, leaders like Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, one of the most authoritarian violators of human rights in the region, along with Iván Duque, the fact that they were welcomed to the United States for the Summit of the Americas, whereas Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua were not welcomed, they were in fact not invited at all, I think it does reflect that double standard. And it's not just Biden, I should say, it's actually bipartisan in the US government.
All right, Ben, looking at the broader relationship between the United States and Latin America, I mean, as our reporter Nathan King as well as Laura Carlton told us a moment ago, Lopez Obrador boycotted that summit of the Americas because of the United States excluding Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. He also refused to go along with sanctions against Russia. How is that kind of Mexican position viewed in Latin America? Is the United States out of step with the region?
Well, absolutely. The U.S. has been out of step with the region for many decades, and we've even seen increasing invocations of the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine from members of Congress and from during the Trump administration. There were numerous people, including Mike Pompeo, Rex Tillerson, who invoked the Monroe Doctrine. This is a colonialist doctrine. So people in Latin America, largely, even some people who lean to the right wing of the spectrum, do have a lot of respect for the newly independent foreign policy of Mexico. And I should say that this Mexican independent foreign policy, actually, it goes back 100 years in Mexican politics to the doctrine that's called the Estrada Doctrine in Mexico. Mexico did have a long history of non-alignment, of neutrality in its foreign policy. And what AMLO, Lopez Obrador, is trying to do is bring back this legacy, going back to the progressive presidents after the Mexican Revolution, including Cárdenas. He really follows in the line of the President Cárdenas in Mexico, and that history is often forgotten when we talk about U.S.-Mexico relations.
Okay. Michael Shifter, does Ben Norton have a point there when he says that the United States can be very selective when it comes to things like corruption and in its relationship with Latin America?
Yeah, I think, clearly there needs to be a lot more consistency, I mean, and this is true of every administration on these issues. And, but I don't think there have been a lot of concerns raised about the Colombian human rights situation. There are a lot of concerns raised about Bolsonaro's authoritarianism and anti-democratic practices. It's no secret that there's a hostility between Biden and Bolsonaro. When they met at the summit, it was the first time that they ever had any communication whatsoever. So the relationship is extremely frosty. And let's also try to reconcile what's been described as kind of heavy-handed Monroe Doctrine, kind of imperialist design, with the fact that the recent Summit of the Americas, which AMLO boycotted, which is fine, I think revealed more than anything else that the United States is losing influence in Latin America. So it's sort of weak, a little bit detached, disconnected, and at the same time, it's this kind of superpower that's kind of calling the shots and using heavy-handed tactics. I think it's hard to reconcile those. The fact is that the United States is, I think, doesn't have the clout and doesn't have the influence that it used to have. Latin America, that's just a reality, and I think that's something that needs to be faced and accepted.
Laura Colton, getting back to Mexico, I mean, this is a country with 130 million people. It has abundant natural resources, and it's it's in the top 15 economies in the world. So why has Mexico underperformed in the last 3 decades or so?
Well, basically because of the adoption of this neoliberal model and the Washington consensus that put all the eggs in the basket of the so-called free market. Mexico is the really the experiment of a free trade agreement with the United States. It already had an economic dependency on the United States as its neighbor and as an economic superpower. And so when NAFTA went into effect, there was this discourse that somehow Mexico was going to be pulled up alongside its neighbor, and the reverse happened, and we saw that there was a greater gap in worker wages, that poverty actually grew during this period of time, and that Mexico was hamstrung in terms of the types of national development policies that the United States took advantage of in order to reach the level of development and wealth that it has, in addition to, of course, looting other countries as an imperialist leader within the world. So that situation in which Mexico was forced to adopt a model with these immense asymmetries between its closest partner was one of the big reasons why the economy never took off the way it did. And now that the government is beginning to chart a somewhat different course, it's very often said that it's the end of neoliberalism in Mexico.
Right.
And I think that that's probably not true. But now that this is happening, it's being seen as a loss of influence by the United States when it should be seen as another alternative in the face of a system that didn't work.
Artist Open, and when we look at the drug-related violence that we've seen in Central America, the poor economies in many of those countries in Central America, the Biden administration's solution to that is to look at the source of those problems. And to that end, it provided $4 billion in aid to tackle corruption, to provide opportunities for people in Central America. That was done some time ago. Has that program worked?
Well, from my understanding, Congress is still has to vote on the approval of the $4 billion for Central America to help the gang-related narco traffickers. So that's to be discussed. But the fact of the matter is, I couldn't disagree more with my colleagues on this show. The fact of the matter is that the private sector is the one that has worked really well after NAFTA and USMCA, and that's why we've seen a decrease in Mexican immigrants coming over to the U.S. until AMLO's administration, which has been a total disaster. The Mexican business community has stopped all investments because they're afraid that he's going to turn Mexico into another failed Venezuela. And the fact of the matter is that the private sector is the solution for Latin America. More government and socialism is not. We have to only look at Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua to see what a disaster those economies are. People are immigrating to other countries, to free countries, in the millions. And so I believe in the private sector. Socialism and communism does not work. And unfortunately, Mexicans are coming to the United States now because AMLO's administration has been a failed economy.
Okay, I am running out of time, but I want to get to one other issue that was discussed at the meeting. Benjamin Norton, one of the major differences between President López Obrador and President Biden is over the imprisonment of the WikiLeaks journalist Julian Assange. Our reporter mentioned that at the beginning of the show. In fact, Obrador said that the Statue of Liberty should be dismantled if Assange is imprisoned in the United States. He's been imprisoned because he exposed alleged lies, alleged war crimes that the United States has committed in Iraq, among other things. We heard some reporting earlier on that even if this was raised at the meeting, that the United States would ignore what the Mexican leader had to say. But despite the U.S. position on this, doesn't it send a powerful message when it comes from the Mexican president on how the United States is treating a journalist?
It absolutely does. And it shows that Mexico is consistent with the international community. We've seen that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions has said that Julian Assange, who is a journalist, is being arbitrarily detained, that he should be freed and given compensation. And Mexico's policy is in accordance with that international principle. It's unfortunate to see the United States and Britain ignoring that. But really briefly, I should also acknowledge, as someone, I live in Nicaragua, I'm a permanent resident of Nicaragua, and the irony of the comments from my colleague here is that, in fact, of Central America, Nicaragua has the least immigration out of Nicaragua. In fact, the plurality of immigration to the United States from Central America comes from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and all of those governments until recently all those governments were right-wing until Honduras recently, and I should remind people that the United States backed a military coup in Honduras in 2009.
Killing all of the young people a few years ago, a lot of Nicaraguan Americans renewed their passport to go back to the United States.
Arthur,
they were working
Arthur,
well.
I'm going to give you a chance. Arthur, I'm going to give you a chance. Ben, finish what you were saying, and I'll get back to Arthur very quickly.
If I were allowed to speak, I would say that in the context of Central America, Nicaragua is one of the most peaceful countries in the region, and neighboring El Salvador has extremely high rates of violence from gangs, which are closely linked to the state. And in Honduras, after the U.S. backed a military coup in 2009, the president, who was subsequently supported by the United States, Juan Manuel Hernandez, now being tried for drug ties. So the reality is that we should look at countries in Central America
I've got 20 seconds, Art. 20 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is in social media. Daniel Ortega started ordering the murder of all those young people, college students, that wanted a free and democratic election. He killed them. He killed them all. And it's in social media. The mothers posted that their kids being killed and assassinated. So all of the Nicaraguans that were U.S. citizens started moving back to the U.S.
I'm afraid I have to go. We have run out of time. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone for being with us on the show. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.